Hey, what's up, herd watchers? We are going to talk while I drive since there's a lot going on and I have a couple minutes, probably about 20 minutes while I'm in the car. So what the heck, let's do this thing. First off, before we get into talking about the circumstances or anything else about what happened at the ball field with the congressman, obviously, it goes without saying that I extend my sympathies to everyone who was injured and everyone who was scared out of their wits during that event. And there's a lot for us to talk to and sort of unpack around it. Now, some of the things we don't know for sure. We're going to talk about what we think we know. We're going to talk about what we're reasonably sure of. And we're going to talk about some of the topics that come up as a result of those things, both the things that we are absolutely sure of and the things that we're not. So let's talk about the event. Given everything we know right now, a 67-year-old white male looks like he drove a significant distance and showed up at the ball field where the Republican congressional baseball team was getting ready to practice for this sort of exhibition game they play tomorrow. And this guy showed up deliberately. Depending on which information you know about or you hear or how it all pans out, it doesn't look like this guy woke up this morning, grabbed the nearest gun and decided to head out and do this thing. It looks like he may have applied for, purchased the weapon, done the waiting periods, and then drove a significant distance specifically with this event in mind to make these shootings. But in any case, so this guy goes ahead and does that. A number of shots were fired, depending on what reports you listen to. It might have been as few as 10. It might have been as many as 50. It looks like this may have been a semi-automatic weapon. It's unclear. I haven't heard a definitive report that it was an automatic weapon. And he was engaged by security personnel who were armed, and that slowed things down enough that people could hide, and then the Capitol Police came and eventually got the situation under control. Now, the real problem from the security point of view is the asymmetrical nature of the circumstance and the weaponry involved. So by all accounts, the security personnel were carrying pistols, which are a perfectly appropriate weapon for guarding a congressman under most circumstances, where you're in a room or you're in an office or there's a crowd that's close by. When you're on a baseball field, which is one of the few times that these Congress people would be exposed to the kind of distances where a long rifle is more useful than a pistol. Not by much, by the way. Even a baseball field is well within the lower range of where you could think of as a long rifle caliber being able to reach out to. So from that perspective, these guys were very close, but it was far enough away that the guys with the pistols were at a distinct disadvantage during this exchange. And this guy got a bunch of shots off, and then they engaged him and they took him down, and there was one congressman was seriously hurt. There were a number of people who were also hurt. There were a couple of Capitol Police who were also hurt. And that's the incident. Those are the facts, with sort of without editorial overlay as to motive or political bias. That's as far as I can take you on the facts. Now let's move to the realm of kind of what we're pretty sure of. And for those of you who don't spend any time on 4chan and sort of the politics board right now, I believe me, I understand. The place is kind of a little swampy in its own way, in the sense that it's a free speech haven, and there's a lot of people in there trying to get a rise out of each other, and it can be pretty rough and tumble. But it also happens to be the place right now where, like the rest of 4chan, so much of what you see bubbling up to Facebook and then bubbling up to the mainstream media after that, it came on poll first. They have a large anonymous contingent, And while it's, very common for people to portray them as sort of just a bunch of basement dwellers, the reality is there are a fair number of people in there who seem to have access to pretty good information and work on various political campaigns across the political spectrum. And, the crowd there also happens to take great joy in using their resources to track down information. So long before this sort of broke in the mainstream, sort of what was happening, but right after it looks like the Capitol Police decided they were going to release the name, Paul had some information on what looks like it is the guy. An hour or two before you saw his photograph and confirmation of this out in the world. By everything we know with a high degree of confidence, this gentleman was a staunch, I'll go just short of saying rabid, Bernie Sanders supporter. It looks like there might have been some relationship concerns, which sort of maybe drove some depression or some despair. Whatever reason, this guy didn't really feel like the consequences of this action were something he was overly concerned about. It doesn't look like there was a religious motivation to any of this. And he, looking at his social media, he spends his days getting more and more angry about sort of the short end of the stick he's been getting and that other people have been getting by those evil capitalist types. Huge Bernie Sanders supporter, totally bought into this sort of highly progressive, we should tax the rich at 70 and 80%, and we should take that money and give it to the people they've been destroying their whole lives. He watched, big fan of The Daily Show, big fan of, Trevor Noah, big fan of Stephen Colbert, big fan of Rachel Maddow. I mean, you look at this guy's likes and the memes he's posting, and he's just entirely immersed in the angriest of the mainstream left. There isn't an enormous connection, which is actually maybe more disturbing. He doesn't have a strong, looks like social media connection to the anti-fascist, I'm going to punch a Nazi group type of people. It doesn't really look like he sort of tripped over and was dealing with that radical side. This is just the anger being expressed by sort of the far left mainstream edge of the movement. And we can speculate, but this is a guy who has been told for a year now and truly believes that his nation was on the edge of collapse, that the government has been taken over by a bunch of Russian agents who are going to use their position to destroy the social safety net, pass healthcare legislation that will result in the mass death of children across the nation. And in this matter of life and death, he clearly felt, or as he saw it, life and death, with no political resource, because he believed those people that the political process was failing. Man, my shirt is just not cooperating today. Well, you'll have to deal with it. And he basically felt that he had no recourse, and that the capitalist sort of higher ups had sort of destroyed democracy. And obviously he felt that what he needed to do was take matters into his own hands. This was absolutely a politically motivated attack. Now, we can say that anyone who decides that what they're going to do is go ahead and grab a gun and go shoot up a bunch of people who are not a direct threat to them is also mentally unstable. But that his motive was not just craziness. He wasn't hearing voices. A potato didn't tell him to do it. This wasn't the only way to save the great cactus god. He was not in pursuit of, the flying spaghetti monster and looking for a blessing of the noodly appendage. He was definitely having trouble separating reality from the paranoid fantasies that were being sort of pushed into his head. But these were the mainstream left paranoid fantasies. This is the kind of stuff you'll see from Rachel Maddow every day. This is the kind of stuff you're starting to hear from Bernie Sanders. This is the kind of stuff that you absolutely heard from Hillary Clinton. This is the stuff that has led now to multiple riots and hundreds of people taking to the street, wrapping bike locks around their fists, and beating Trump supporters, all while screaming that it's their job to shut down the fascism of the right. Meanwhile, Trump supporters 0 riots, 0 incidents of Trump supporters in an organized way attempting to shut down rallies or political speech by their opponents, 0 incidents of Trump supporters basically organizing themselves into these violent sort of armadas, or what's the word I'm looking for? Militias. And, you know, getting together in groups and wrapping their faces in whatever. And this is all the left. And this has been coming, as you've seen in my previous video. Look, this is the end result of 15 or 20 years of the left equating speech with violence so that they can then feel justified in using violence against anyone who says anything they don't like. And in this particular case, these people truly are buying into the idea that if the government isn't going to pay for your health care and make your health care for free, then it is the government's fault if you die. That your right to health care is so absolute that if anything goes wrong and you can't afford health care and you die, that's murder by the government and everyone who didn't go ahead and pay you for your health care. So in other words, if I don't give you my money, that I have murdered you. And that's where they are. And from that point of view, this guy decided that he was, it looks like this guy decided that he was going to go out and stop the murder. Now, am I in any way saying that Rachel Maddow shouldn't be saying what she's saying? Nope. Free country, she can do what she wants. I agree. Do I think that Rachel Maddow's speech, and I'm using her, but I mean, you know, Trevor Noah and Stephen Colbert and these guys, do I think that their speech crosses the line into directly culpable? No. But do I think that their speech is much, much closer to the line than anything they've ever spent 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, screaming that Donald Trump is responsible for? Yes. And you know, and I know, that if this guy had shot up a bunch of Democrats and his Facebook page had a bunch of Pepe the Frog memes on it, or he had been a Breitbart poster, we would have wall-to-wall, 24/7 CNN coverage with any number of experts talking about how Donald Trump's climate of hate has created this violence. So I just want to make sure that we all understand exactly how much bullshit there is in the media as to how they create this stuff. And you know it. You know they and the left creates and destroys these sort of paranoid, violent responses as needed. Have you noticed how since the election, suddenly there isn't an epidemic of black youth being shot by white cops? That's just not a thing anymore. Have you noticed how when it was no longer politically expedient and George Soros stopped dumping a ton of money into it, that the marches on the streets, Black Lives Matter thing went away? And that suddenly, whole cloth, the anti-fascist movement sprung up with basically the same people using basically the same money and organizing around basically the same places. But suddenly the entire motive for this grassroots thing changed because these groups are essentially the militant, violent arm of the Democratic Party, paid for by Democratic donors. It's not even a question. And the Democratic Party has a long history of this, of sort of these sort of fake grassroots paramilitary groups that wander the countryside using violence. The most famous of which, the Ku Klux Klan, Democratic organization created by the Democrats, used by the Democrats, funded by the Democrats, staffed by the Democrats, and used as a political army when the Democrats wanted to make sure that under no circumstances were they going to allow the Republicans to let those evil minorities become full citizens. So you look at the two parties, and the party with the history of institutional political violence is the Democratic Party. And you can draw that line from the Ku Klux Klan all the way through the riots of the 60s, all the way through the racially based riots of the 70s and early 80s, all the way through the Justice riots and the Rodney King wake kind of a thing, and straight out through the Black Lives Matter riots, the Trayvon Martin stuff, and now they're calling it anti-fascist because it makes sense. But it's all the same thing. It's a bunch of grassroots people spontaneously showing up someplace where a whole bunch of Democratic mega donors have pumped a whole bunch of money into community organizers, and that name should seem familiar, so that these people can, amazingly enough, show up on a spontaneous demonstration with tens of thousands of dollars of pre-printed signs, and right on cue, the news media is there, and they, sort of do their interviews, and as you've seen, CNN stage manages all of this, and it's basically a circular triangle of, the media providing the narrative spin to contextualize the violence, and then that media driving donations to the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party feeding money to the violent grassroots organizations that then allow the media to use that as fodder for the narrative. And that little triangle goes around. And the Democrats love that triangle, by the way. That triangle happens all the time. You get, look at this. The unions, because government has regulated that unions are essentially untouchable and very powerful, and that even people who aren't really a fan of the union political thing winds up having to donate money to the union, which can be used for political purposes. So the government passes a law that feeds a ton of money to the unions. The unions use that money to campaign and organize for political figures. The political figures then use their power to pay back the unions by making sure that the cycle continues. Now, we could argue that the Republicans do the same thing, and they do in a way. The Republicans will award the Republicans will maybe lower a regulation so that a company can make a bunch more money, and that company will obviously funnel some of that money into the Republican candidates' coffers. And there's one critical ethical difference, and I'm not ethically thrilled about either of those things as a direct exchange. On the flip side, I'm perfectly, look, I'm a small business guy. I'm obviously going to put my money into the campaign of the guy who's going to pass regulations that are beneficial to the small business. I'm not particularly worried about that. That's just the political market in action. It's that direct one-for-one collusion that I dislike. But the difference here is that when a Republican lowers a regulation and allows a company to make more money in the free market, that's not the same thing as the government coming in and using government-sponsored violence, i.e. the police, and laws, and threatening people with jail if they don't make sure that they, give preferential treatment to the union, or that the government will come in and misuse government power to shut down a company if the union gets annoyed and gets their friend in Congress to. So it's the addition of government-sponsored violence and the misuse of government force that sort of adds a super kick of how much this sucks to the way the Democrats do it, because the Democrats are big fans of using the government as a tool of institutional violence to further their political gain. Now, you can disagree. That's fine. Leave a comment down below wherever you see this on YouTube or Facebook. If you're watching me on Facebook, follow the link to the YouTube channel. For the love of God, please go subscribe to YouTube. Okay? All right. So with that aside. So anyway, do I think that the speech of these people should be curtailed? No. But I just want to make sure we're absolutely clear about the fact that these guys are doing stuff that CNN and MSNBC would have spent 24 hours a day hammering the Republicans are, and that nobody cares anymore. That sort of hypocrisy has completely and utterly failed them, but they're still trying it. If any Republican media figure had shown up with a severed Barack Obama head, the cries of racism and cultural appropriation would have been astounding. There would actually have been riots and violence in the street. Doesn't happen when somebody threatens Donald Trump. Certainly is not racist because he's a white guy. And notice how interesting that is. That the Democrats have set up a social system where any attack on them is inherently worse than any attack on the Republicans. Because they've set the moral, we've allowed them to define the morality of this circumstance, and they tell us it's worse. So it's got to be worse. So anyway, this Bernie Sanders loving left-wing crackpot who has finally been convinced by the mainstream left media after a year of hammering on it that Donald Trump is a direct threat and that the Republicans are actually attempting to kill people, decides to take a gun and go shoot up a bunch of Republicans. And the most clear response from the Democratic Party after this